All right, so tonight we are going to be talking about Genesis 1 and 2. We're not going to, we're going to deal with the verses, but we're not going to read all of them like we do on a typical Sunday. On Sunday, I usually preach line by line, verse by verse. I don't want to leave anything out. But tonight we're going to we're going to probably take more of a thematic view. We're going to look at some verses of these two chapters. But I'll tell you, one of the reasons why this intrigues me and why I wanted to do this is because it was taking a Genesis class that really changed me. I went into seminary and, growing up as a missionary kid, growing up with a pastor for a father, I kind of figured I knew all this stuff. And so, I know the Bible, whatever. And so I went into this Genesis class and kind of with the mentality of like, I know all this stuff. I know what these are all about, and I started with my professor, and then I was just floored of how much I didn't actually know. So that's what changed me, as I realized I didn't actually know the Bible that well. I thought I knew about it because I knew about, I feel like a lot of us kind of stay at that storybook level where you have like the illustrations and the little kids version Bibles. I knew like the general stories, but not necessarily like the depth that is in the text. So this is one of the first ones that really just started me down a path of wanting to study the Bible more. So we're going to look at Genesis 1 and 2. So if you get a chance, I want you to go over to Genesis 1 and 2, and we're just going to begin to kind of think through it together. Before we do this, here's what I want us to talk about before. Genesis is part of what we call in Hebrew, we call it the Torah, which is the law. In English, sometimes we call it the Pentateuch. And Jews had their division in their Bible. So like, for instance, if you were going to look and see, Jesus in his Bible even had this division. You'll see this like in Luke chapter 24. He said, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses," which is the first 5 books, "the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And that's how Jews talk about their Bible. They call it the Tanakh. So the T is Torah, the N is the Nebaim, which is the prophets, and that includes, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, all the stories about prophets, and then all the prophets. And then you have, in this, they call it the Psalms, and it's not out of the ordinary. That's the biggest book in the writing section. And so the Psalms, and you get Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs, and in that's included like, some of the stories that we love and cherish, but they don't really have prophets in them. So you get things like the story of Esther and stuff like that in that section. But that being said, that's how that's how the Jewish Bible is understood, is in those 3 parts. And what's interesting is this part right here, this law of Moses. And they understood that to be the first 5 books. So one of the things I want us to be thinking about, if we're going to really try to understand Genesis better, is we need to remind ourselves that Genesis is one part of 5. And the reality is it's 5 books because scroll space. That these are not just, it's not that they were 5 individual books. That's not like Moses wrote Genesis and then he finished, he thought, I should have a follow-up one, I hope I make another book. Everyone's asking, Genesis was wild, man. We should get, hopefully you make a part 2. That's not how it goes. In fact, it's a unified story if you follow it all the way through. There's a point of what they want to do and how he tells the story. If you've ever actually looked at like Genesis, even the reason we call it Genesis in the original language is they just take the first word of the book, and that's what the title is. We label it something different, but like if you were to look at for instance, the book of Exodus, like that's right there. It's just the second word right there. And so these are the names. The names is what that one is. So there's no sense that these are 5 individual books. These are one book, but we find it divided up. Another way to think about it might be like when you read the book of Psalms. If you were to ever look at the book of the Psalms, actually the book of the Psalms is in is in 5 parts. So like I'll show you where you'll see, if you've never actually seen, let's see, what is this book? I'll show you book 2. So for instance, if you ever look in the book of Psalms, you'll see things like right before 42, we call it book 2. And you'll see that in there, that we do recognize that the book came together in 5 parts, but it's one unified book. So that's something I want us to keep in mind before we take on Genesis, because I think a lot of the time we read Genesis as if it's just one standalone book. If it's in fact part of the 5, then we need to begin to think of it as really part of it, especially these first 2 chapters, as the introduction to the 5 books, right? That this is a book that's starting off the rest of the 5 of where we're going to go. And so one of the things that changed how I've read the Bible too is we do need to read it in the same way we would read any text. That when you read a text, you read and you have an introduction and you have a body and you've got, especially in the storyline, you start with the intro and then you're headed somewhere. You get kind of the climax of the story, and then you get kind of the end of the story and how things get wrapped up. And so we need to do that with Genesis as well, and recognize that Genesis is telling us something about the rest of the Pentateuch, the rest of the law. So with that being in mind, that's how I want us to think about this. Let's start with the premise that this is the introduction, not just to Genesis, but this is the introduction to the rest of the Pentateuch. Okay, let's start off and let's see how this goes, because that's what I'd like us to do, is just begin to read through some of it and see what we find out. Okay, all right. So we begin in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then it goes on to say, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered over the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from darkness. And he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was an evening, there was morning, one day." Let's read a little bit more, because what I want to do is, before I get to what I think how we should interpret this, I want us to kind of be familiar with what it says and then go through maybe a few options of how people look at this, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. So then God said, "Let there be an expanse between the water, separating water from water." So God made the expanse, separating the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse, and it was so. He called the expanse sky. And evening, then morning, second day. So we have light, dark. Now we have the sky made on the second day. Then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place. Let dry ground appear." So the image, right, is that there is it's water everywhere, and now we're creating dry land here. And it was so. So God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit and seed according to their kinds." And it was so. And the earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and the trees bearing fruit with seed and according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning the third day. This is a fun one, and we'll probably try to answer that in a little bit. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They'll serve as signs in the seasons for the days and the years. There'll be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on earth," and it was so. So God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule over the day and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, then morning, the 4th day. Then God said, "Let the water swarm with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them. "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters and the seas. Let the birds multiply on the earth." Evening came, then morning, 5th day. We're almost there. Then God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, and it was so. And God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And they will rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. And God said, look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This is the food for you. For all the wildlife of the earth, every bird of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having breath of life, and I've given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the sixth day. And it goes on a little bit more to finish this account. So the heavens, the earth, and everything in them were completed. And on the seventh day, God completed from his work that he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. All right, so those are the 6 creation days, and the seventh day he rested. The big question is, what's really going on here? I want to run through some options, right, of how people think through these, of how we do this. So, look, when we take the text of Genesis, what we usually want to do is we want to say, okay, I read this and I need to explain the world out there somehow with the text, right? Like you're wanting to know, like I was probably, okay, this is great. When did this happen? And so typically what we do is we launch into kind of 2 major camps, which we would call, you have what's called the Old Earth camp, and you have the Young Earth camp. And so Old Earth says, okay, that this can fit or it may not fit and we're going to account for millions and millions and billions of years. And you have the Young Earth camp that typically says, no, we're going to account for this, and we actually look out and think that the world is actually close to just, about 10,000 years. And so we'll talk about that, right, of why we get there, okay? So part of why we divide up is over how we deal with the world outside around us. When we read this text, it seems pretty straightforward, right, that we're dealing with the fact that there are 6 days. God creates light. He creates the sky. He creates the land and the sea. He creates vegetation. He has the lights out that he forms for people to be able to look at, the stars and the moon. You've got sea animals, and then you've got land creatures, and then humans. All of that stuff happening over those 6 days. The question is that how we're supposed to read it? Is it meant to be read as 6 literal days? Is it meant to be read, as a story that happened? Is it poetic? All that kind of stuff are the kind of questions we get into. But I think a lot of the time we do that is because we're asking what my starting point is. And so let me kind of walk through some different approaches to this. And I want to just get to the text and talk through it. But here's one of the first approaches. So we have because of where we're at today in the world, obviously evolution has changed the way a lot of people think about the world. And so evolution is often kind of taught as fact. And so you'll have a lot of people that will say, okay, it's very clear to see that evolution is how things came about, and not through this. So that was what we would call, naturalistic evolution, which is there is no God. We have the things all come from nothing. The process starts, boom, here we are today. Okay, that doesn't fit with this. There are people though who ascribe to evolution, and that would be a camp which is called Theistic Evolution. And so here's how Theistic Evolution goes. Those are people who, now granted, I want you to understand our starting points. These are people who are very scientific. I'll just show you some images of, if you're interested in some of this. So for instance, let's see if I can pop this up. Does it pop up? Yeah. So like Theistic Evolution, these are people who are committed to the Bible. They believe, there are evangelicals that are in this camp, but they look at the world around and they say that, yes, we think evolution came, but what we think is that God guided the process of evolution. And as God guided the process of evolution, either one of two things took place, right? That either man is separate of himself, and there are some who parse that out, or that he guided evolution all the way to where we are today as humans, but he was over that process. He started it, and he oversaw all of evolution. Now, what happens in this camp is when you read the text then, the text becomes a little bit more kind of poetic to these people. They begin to say, because evolution has taken place and God guided the process of evolution, this must be talking about poetry. This must be just kind of a way to just describe the world. And some would even probably say something like this. Well, that's how they understood it. Back in those days, everybody kind of had their own myths. They had their own way, but no one, the Bible, often you'll hear it said like this: the Bible's not a science book. And so as a result, what we do is we say, this is what they believed, this is what they thought, but we know that, through science that evolution took place. And so this must be either that it's poetic or it must be wrong. It might be, just kind of primitive man's trying to approach to understanding where we came from. Now, that there are some who I think who are in the evolutionary camp who would say that that this text is not actually meaning to talk about our origins. And that's another conversation to have. But generally speaking, when you start with evolution, and even if you're a believer and you say theistic evolution is the approach, you kind of have to do away with this discussion. Another big question you have to have if you're an old earth person is you have to ask the question of this is, if we've had millions and millions of years of evolution taking place, what do we do with death before the fall? Right? In chapter 3, that's where Adam and Eve take the fruit and then death comes. Do we have death taking place before the fall? That's an interesting discussion to have. Maybe some other time we can do that one. But that's kind of approach one. As you have an old earth approach, which says we look at this, we don't really deal with the text too much. We don't really think about it too much because it's poetry or it's their attempt, or as some camps would say, it's not even really talking about our origins. It's just talking about how God made the world and how he wanted it to be set up. And really the point is, and this is where I would say evangelicals who are theistic evolutionists would say, they drive home a major point, which is a major point, that God created the universe, right? That's one of the things that's different when you read this account from other creation accounts in antiquity, is you don't have one God doing it all. You have multitudes of gods, and they're over certain parts and doing certain things, but in the Bible, you have one God who does it all. He's over it all. And so that's a big thing that they would say, that this is really a polemic against them, and this is to show that our God did it all. And so that's how some try to balance that. Now, I think another old earth approach that I think is, these guys are ones that I think they're not trying to kind of wipe the text away as irrelevant. They're not trying to wipe the text away as just poetic. Are guys that we would say who are in a camp called progressive creationism, or day-age creationism. So I'll show you an image on this. There's a contention that when you're reading those 6 days as they're unfolding, these guys say that these days actually correspond to geological periods in our. You can look and see that in geology. You can go and see that in the strata of things that we have dug up. And so there are some very committed strong believers who are like, for instance, this guy's name is Hugh Ross. He runs a ministry out of in the LA area, Covina, but he has a ministry called Reasons to Believe. And Hugh Ross is an old earth guy, but he's what's a day age guy. And here's how he gets there. He believes that the word day, as we read it in the text, right, that we get into this text right here, and it says there was evening, there was morning, one day. Right? It was so, and God called the expanse sky, came morning, second day. That day is a period of time. And there's actually biblical warrant for that. For instance, often like a phrase used by the prophets. They'll talk about the day of the Lord. And when you begin to read in the prophets about what the day of the Lord is, it's sometimes this big, unspecified period of time where the judgment of the nations is occurring, and then he sets up his kingdom and will rule and provide righteousness and judgment for everybody. And so there's some warrant to seeing, even within the text itself in the Old Testament, that day may not simply mean just 24 hours, right? And we know that as we talk about how Jews thought, even when it came to just the way they did days, and we think about like even the resurrection story, right? Day need not necessarily be 3 full 24-hour days. It's parts of days, too, that they included. A part is included as a whole day. And so there's some wiggle room on that. Now, what I find interesting about these guys is they recognize that day could mean that. The big question is that what the text is trying to say? And I don't think it is, but I do think that these guys, if I was going to say people that I think have really good, who are old earth guys, who I think are really strong believers, that are trying to wrestle with this. These guys over at like Reasons to Believe with Hugh Ross, these guys are good guys. But Hugh Ross is an astronomer. He looks out and he says, I see this age. And so he actually, as he has kind of started from science, has said that I think that what we're seeing here is if you were to look at the fossil layers, we're seeing these periods unfold exactly how the text unfolds. And so if you ever want to have some fun with that, look on YouTube and type in Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross, and he'll walk through that. This is what's called day age, that each day is a unspecified period of time. We don't know how long it is, but it seems to be, they say, it fits perfectly with this. Now, these guys would not be evolutionists necessarily. These guys say that you can see in these fossil, boom, this explosion onto the scene with a new kind of creature that comes with every period. But that's the day age approach there. And so it's not necessarily 24 hours is how they explain it. And so when they would read Genesis, they're saying this is kind of the way that God unfolded the world over these massive periods of time. And here we are today. So that's those guys. Another approach is what is called, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this, is called the gap theory. Gap theory actually used to be a really popular Christian interpretation of the text. If you remember, if you know, it's kind of a generational thing, the Scofield Reference Bible. The Scofield Reference Bible was one that, especially in the early 1900s, was the study notes Bible that you needed. And when you have gap theory come into play, this is what kind of popularized everything, is actually how you read verse 2. So here's how Scofield notes, and here's how gap theory begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom, it's done. Now, something takes place, though, in verse 2 that is not explained, is how they get there. Now, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered over the surface of the watery depths. Now, here's where they go. I want to show you some references that they say kind of highlight this. So if you look at something like Jeremiah 24:23, look at, as Jeremiah is talking about judgment that has just occurred in Israel, in the land. Notice what he says in chapter 4, verse 23. I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. I looked to the heavens, and their light was gone. I looked at the mountains, and they were quaking, and all the hills shook. I looked, and there was no human being, and all the birds of the sky had fled. I looked on the fertile field. It was a wilderness. All the cities were torn down because of the Lord and his burning anger. Now, you notice this phrase, right? Formless and empty. The earth was formless and empty. And it's references like this that made people say, did something take place? Did something take place between verse 1 and verse 2? Is
that in chapter 1 of Jeremiah?
That was Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23. Now, there's another one I'll just show you really quickly. This is Isaiah 24. Look, the Lord is stripping the earth bare and making it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. This is this image, right, that something has taken place. And so here's what the gap theorists do. The gap theorists say something must have taken place between verse 1 and verse 2. Because we start with this perfect world, and now this place is seen like a wasteland of judgment that has taken place. And so, what you'll see is, now I think this is an interesting perspective to ask, is verse 1, between verse 1 and verse 2, is this where, like the fall of Satan occurred? Now, some say that that's what took place, that God builds this up as beautiful, this incredible planet, and something takes place between 1 and 2, and that's what some would posit, is that Satan has fallen, because we know that Job tells us that angels were present at creation, singing for joy when God was doing all of this. And so at some point, it seems like that the world has had this judgment upon it, and it seems like, some try to throw in there, maybe that's when Satan fell. Between 1 and 2, he fell, he caused this havoc, this chaos, and then God judges the world, and that's why we are left off with this kind of, wasteland, this judged planet. It's an interesting perspective. I kind of like that they at least try to put that somewhere. Now, some will critique the gap theorists and say, look, you're just trying to have it both ways. You're just trying to, that you're not legitimately trying to put the fall of Satan in there. You're just trying to mash in billions of years, because here's what typically you can do with the gap theory, right? If the gap theory is the case, what typically goes like this is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and that was over millions and billions of years. And then later on, he begins to have to recreate and restructure the world. And so they throw all that time into that verse 1, and then verse 2 picks up where we are now. And so that's kind of the critique of the gap theorists, is they're just trying to have it both ways and just throw it in. And but it's an interesting perspective, because you can't not see those textual connections. Something's going on there. I don't think they're right about those connections. I think there's another way to do it. But that's another way to look at it. Another way to just kind of think through this as well is what you would see what's called young earth. And here's young earth's approach, right? Young earth says there's 6 literal days. They're 24-hour periods. They're not periods of time. When you read it, if you were just reading it and not trying to think of anything else, you're reading a story about 6 literal days. This stuff unfolds. And then how do we get to its young still? Well, here's what you do. If you want to figure out why young earth stay young, and they say this is why we think it's just thousands and thousands of years, when you get to, let's just go to chapter 5. Chapter 5 gives us the genealogy of Adam. And he's focusing on the line getting us all the way to Noah. But when you begin to add up the years of all these individuals, you get to a significant amount of time, but still it puts us in the thousands, not the millions. And so just a straightforward reading the genealogy of Genesis 5, that's kind of how you get there. And so young earth are committed to saying we're reading it just as it is. And young earth would say, especially if you were to look at people like the kind of the Answers in Genesis guys, they would say, look, the reality is the science is actually there to prove our case. The guys, if you were to look at anything, if you ever go to Answers in Genesis, they're young earth guys and tons of material on this. And they say a lot of the dating that's out there is flawed to begin with. It's really interesting. They do a lot to make a really strong case for what the age of the earth is. And they would say we're committed from a biblical perspective of trying to examine everything, and we're not coming into this with kind of an evolutionary lens. We're not committed to that, but they see that young earth is completely compatible with the scientific method today. Now, I always find it really interesting. There's conferences that happen every year, and one of them is called the Evangelical Theological Society, and this is where if you're a Christian professor or pastor, you sometimes want to go to these ones, especially if you're a professor, because this is where the new textbooks are coming out and all that stuff. But there's a huge room of vendors and just booths to meet and talk. And I always love the fact that when you go in there, you've got the young Earth Answers in Genesis booth on this end, and then like a few down are the old Earth guys. And this is not necessarily, when we have this debate, not necessarily a liberal versus a conservative approach, right? These are people saying, I'm trying to deal with what I see out there in science, and I'm trying to come to a best conclusion of that. So I got to tell you, the more time goes on, the more I'm skeptical of findings in science. And I'm very skeptical when people say the science is settled, right? Like that's not how that works, right? There's a scientific method which we're always testing things and we're always seeing if things, what's really happening. But I'm not somebody who wants to put all my eggs in the science basket necessarily, because you find things change with new discoveries and new tests that we make. So anyways, typically when we discuss Genesis, we get stuck in that debate and we don't really think of the text past those conversations. So here's what I'd like us to do now. For just a little bit of time, I want us to go back and I want us to look at some of these words that are actually in the text, and I want us to think about it not from the perspective of how does this work with old Earth, how does this work with young Earth. Like I want you to put blinders on for just a few minutes and not try to think about how does that connect to the world outside? Because that is an apologetics question. Apologetics is, how do I defend for the faith? How do I make a defense for the faith? And that's an important question of how does this gel with what we know of the world around us from what we've discovered? When I'm talking with an unbeliever, I want to try to show them that this is not just a text filled with errors, but that it's a smart text, it's a beautiful text, and it actually connects with the world outside. But for a few minutes, I want us to not think in terms of old or young, right? Because that's where I think we get so locked in, we miss everything because we're missing the point of what the text is actually saying. Okay, so a couple of things I want us to start thinking through as we look at the text now. So we start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, a couple of things we need to notice. This first word here, beginning, if you actually read how it's used in the text, that word usually is a starting point in history. It's a starting point in history, and it has an end in mind already. It's not just once upon a time, here we go, but it's a starting point. It says in the beginning, and there's an end, a definite end in mind to this period. That's how it starts. One of the other things that we see as God creates, and this is a very specific word of how God creates, is that he is doing something. It's a new work of how he is creating. And then we get to this heavens and earth. Now, what's interesting about this is when heavens and earth are together like that in the original language, when you see the words heavens and earth together, they're not just meaning two separate things. If he was to say heavens, by the way, why do you think it says heavens plural? You know why we call it the heavens? Because some faiths will say they have like layers of heaven, right? I was always confused in the 90s, or that show Seventh Heavens, like what the... I don't even know what that means. Like, what is that? Okay, right? But here's how that works, right? In Hebrew mindset, you have kind of three heavens. You have the sky, outer space, and then where God resides. There's kind of that understanding of those, how that is. So all of that is that. But when you read these two together, the heavens and the earth, we're not just talking about sky, and we're not just talking about the earth. We're talking about something totality. For instance, here's a little example that you would see from like Isaiah chapter 44, verse 24. This is what the Lord, your Redeemer who formed you from the womb says, I am the Lord who made everything. I stretched out the heavens by myself, who alone spread out the earth. Like this is, when he's talking about these things together, this is all things, right? I made everything is what he says. And what does that mean in Isaiah when he says, I made everything, I made the whole universe, and he says, I stretched out the heavens, I stretched out the earth. And so what I contend is being said here is that when heavens and earth are together, this is a statement of totality. This is the entire universe is already created. One more little thing that's it's interesting to think about, right, is Joel chapter 3, verse 15. Notice what it says here. The sun and the moon will grow dark, and the stars will cease their shining. The Lord will roar from Zion. He'll make his voice heard over Jerusalem. Heaven and earth will shake, but the Lord will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the Israelites. What I think is interesting about this is Hebrew poetry. And notice what he says. The sun and the moon and the stars are all considered part of what? Heavens and the earth shaking, right? That's all totality together. And so when we know the language, what we do see is when these two are together, this is what I contend is this is the universe. In the beginning, God created the universe. Everything in the universe done, finished. Now, we got to deal with this. Now, the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered over the surface of the watery depths. Now, a question that we eventually need to ask as well is, how do you read verse 1? Is verse 1 a title, or is verse 1 an action? Think about that for just a second. Because if you're like me, I've read it like this in the past. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now I'm going to tell you how he did that. But I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's telling you, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Done. It's over. It's finished. And now he's starting something. Here's the way to kind of think of this, and this is what I want to contend is going on here. Everyone pretty much knows I'm a Star Wars fan, and all my illustrations, usually when I teach, goes to Star Wars. But if you ever have watched Star Wars, they always start with this giant widescreen expanse at the very beginning of the movies. Everything's outer space. And then as you go forward, the camera lens begins to zoom in, and you're starting to get into like one little spot. And then you've got this little spaceship, or you've got this little part of this, something's going on where you've gone from wide lens outer space to now one little particular thing is in view. And I think that's what's going on here. We start with a statement of what has happened. It's done. It's finished. And now God is taking his focus, and he's focusing on something very small. How small, though? Well, this is the one that changed me here. Now, when you think earth, what do you think about? When you hear the word earth, what comes to mind? The planet, right? We can't help but think about the planet, right? Those satellite images of the earth. Now, question, just this, what was that? About land. When you think about these people at that time, did they have a concept necessarily of the way they understand earth like we do? Probably not. I mean, maybe they understood. I mean, there's some debate about, I don't think everybody was just a flat earth person at that time, but maybe. But anyways, I don't think that they're thinking in terms of that. Here's what I think is really fascinating. We sometimes think of it like that. That's a carryover. It's an old word. And if you understand how earth used to mean, especially if you were to read something like the old King James, earth did not mean the whole planet necessarily. Earth was ground and dirt. It's a carryover, right? It can mean something very different today than it does back then. Now, here's what I think is fascinating. I want to show you something that changed me, because now I told you at the very beginning, I want you to think in terms of this is an introduction to the book, right? Watch what happens when I look at what the original word is. I'm just going to do a search for how that word is used in the rest of the Pentateuch, okay? How that word earth is used in the rest of the Pentateuch. Now, as we're in Genesis, it's pretty much used of the earth, right? Especially in the creation account, it's used the earth. And I'll blow this up so you guys can see this a little bit larger so you're not having to squint at everything, okay? But I want to show you this. Once we get out of Genesis, here's a couple things to notice. Actually, you start to see it here already, verse 4. It already starts to see the different nuance of how it's typically translated. Land. You'll begin to see as you go a little bit further through. And I think the reason we translate it some ways is because we're still how we're trying to think of it. Every translation has some interpretation involved with it. But as you go a little bit further to like the story of, let's just get to Abraham, shall we? Like we're going to move just a few. We're going to get out of the Noah story. We're going to get out of some of the larger ones. Let's get to the rest of the book. Wow, that's jumped a huge bit. I didn't mean to jump that far. Let's go to Genesis, and we'll get to like 12 where Abraham is. I want you to notice how this text is used. And it takes a long time to get there. Okay. Notice here. Let's start seeing in 10. Because we get how we translate it now in these sections. We don't call it the earth of Shinar. We don't call it from that earth he went to Assyria and built. We don't see that, right? We're starting to talk about specific locations. We're talking about a specific kind of small area of land. Now, this is where it gets kind of fun, right? Let's show you 12. When Abraham pops onto the scene. The Lord said to Abram, go from your land, your relatives, your father's house, to the land I will show you. So this is the setup, right? Because I want to ask you for just a second, and I'll show you just a second how if we just go to Exodus and we start to see more of the story, I mean, by this point too, it's all, if you look at how it's being translated, for the most part, we're talking about land. Like these are locations, specific areas, right? Ground, right? It's the ground, it's the land. Here's where I think it's fun because you have the Abraham promise. I'm going to give you this land, right? But I want to show you once you get to something like Exodus where it really takes off. Because remember, this is 5 books. Genesis is the introduction to the full 5. What does it say, and how does that word used in the rest of the Pentateuch? It's all written by Moses, right? How does he use that in other sections? And as you can see, it's a very prominent word. They're talking about lands and areas that they lived in, but I want to get you to Exodus because this is where it also gets really fun, and it's just taking forever to scroll through. But I want you to see and not miss this as you can see all of them. Okay. Yeah, though here we go. And I've come down, this is God speaking to Moses, to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And I promise you that I will bring you up from the misery of the land, the Canaanites and the Hittites, if the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so you have to see, sometimes it means ground poured on there, but for the most part, here's what I want to show you, is when you begin to follow the rest of the book begins to talk about leaving the land of Egypt and going where? The promised land, right? Like that's the central part of the book, right? So follow me with the story for just a second. We start with Genesis, and at the end of the book of Genesis, we've focused down from Adam all the way to Abraham, and then we focus on Abraham has his sons, and we focus from Abraham to Isaac, and then Isaac has sons, but we focus from Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. And they sell the poor little guy to Joseph into slavery, goes into Egypt, and God preserves them there. And while they're in Egypt, creates a nation. It's a story that is all connected. And then the point is, after they're there for 400 years in slavery, his goal is to bring them out and to give them what he promised Abraham in chapter 12, which is the promised land, where you find things like God says, I will be your God, you'll be my people. Like he's going to live amongst them. In Deuteronomy, you find it's a place that he's going to put his name. He's going to have a temple there and a place that he will live amongst his people. And so that is kind of an interesting thing to think of, right? Here's where I'm going with this, is that when you begin to do the words, you kind of look at how this works out. What I contend is actually taking place here is we're not looking at the entire globe anymore. We're looking at a spot on the planet that is completely uninhabitable, right? When those guys use those verbs to say, the verses to say it was formless and empty, it's not that they're saying it was judged. They're saying, I'm going to wipe this place out and make it uninhabitable like it used to be. That when God created the whole world, it was this water world mass. And here we are now, what is he doing? At some point, he has decided to do what? To now make this a place that becomes what? Habitable for people. Right? Because that's how the story gets to. We get to chapter to the 6th day where we want to place people there, and his goal is to live amongst the people and to be with them. And so here's what I think is going on in chapter 1, right? Chapter 1, I think, is taking place as probably something like this. Now, the promised land, the land that they are living in, as Moses is writing this, is getting them ready to, it used to be formless and empty. It used to be just a wasteland. Nothing was there. It was dark. No one could live there. It was a water world, right? Now, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And now God brings light to the land. And then we find out not as there's still light, but it's still a water world, right? So what happens next? Well, what does he see? We now begin to see he's going to separate. He's going to have waters that are going to be in the clouds above, and he's going to have waters below. You're going to have the sky. And then in the third day, you've got now this water world has separated. Now you have this dry land finally appear, where no one could live there before. And now you have this ground appear there. And now there's seas and there's dry land. And now that area is going to be filled with vegetation as well. It's going to have all these fruit trees, and it's going to have all these plants there. And that's what you see on the third day. Now, this is an interesting one, right? Because what do you do with day 4? Because did we go from having light and then having the sun have to be made and the moon having to be made again? Or where's the light coming from? Here's what I think is interesting. If you actually look at the words, right? The words here, especially in this, God said, let there be lights. He's not actually doing anything at this point. He's just saying, this is what I want to have happen. There are going to be lights in the sky that will separate the day from the night. They'll serve as signs, and they will be for seasons and for days and years. There'll be lights on the expanse of the sky to provide light to the earth. And it was there. So he made, this word right here is not the same word of creation out of nothing, by the way. It's not the same word as create. The word made often is a fashioning one. It's working it and fashioning it to what it needs to be. And so I contend what's going on here is now we're looking at this plot of land, and now you could look up, and now you're able to finally go from light to dark. Now I can actually see the light outside. You ever have fun where you're looking out, you're like, can I actually see where the sun is, or is it just a cloud? It's a cloud covering. I can't see where the light's coming from. I just know the light's out there. Now what he's doing is he's now purposing the light. You're able to see the light now. You're able to see the moonlight from this plot of land. You're able to see the stars now that go over it, and you're able to see them for what they are and the purpose that they have. Then you get into the next day, right? You get the creatures that come to swim, all the fish and the large sea creatures. That seems to be some pretty big animals that are being created at this point. They come in there. One of the things he tells them, be fruitful, multiply. Then you get the last day, which is you have land creatures, and essentially you've got livestock, domesticated animals, kind of creatures that crawl, the creepy crawlers, the insects, the bugs, and then the wild animals that are essentially, those are the 3 kind of categorized ones that they have that happen on that day. And then you have something completely separate, and this is what you know about, is separate. Right? It's because this is the point. It's not that God's just making a bunch of things, but he's getting to the pinnacle of the whole week, which is this. Let us make man in our image. By the way, that's an important reference right there, because Jews have had a long time had difficulty with that passage. Who is he talking to when he says, let's make man in our image? Because if he's talking to angels, they don't have the same nature. We're not talking about that in that way. He must be talking to someone. And so they say, well, he must be talking about himself, like you would, like in certain languages you call it like the majestic plural. Like for instance, in French, you're always told that when you speak to somebody, you refer to them in the plural because that shows them honor as opposed to in the singular. And like maybe the queen would say, we do these things, and she's referring to herself, but really, she uses the plural. So could be that's it, but I don't think he's doing that. I think he's talking amongst himself, which we now, as believers on the New Covenant side, know extra information on that is the Trinity. Let's make man in our image according to our likeness. And notice what the purpose is. They're going to be what? To rule over all of it. He's made them so that they would be his representatives over it all. The fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, the creatures that crawl on the earth. So he created man in his image. He created them in the image of God, and he created them male and female. That's also key too, that both are created in the image of God. Both have the image in them. And then he tells them as well, be fruitful, multiply, rule, subdue it, rule of the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, every creature that crawls on the earth. And then he gives them all these things. So that's the first thing that we need to see. And so here's what I contend is going on. This is the first piece. Does this sound similar at all to anything else in the Bible so far? Of God creating a place in which there's going to be a lot of vegetation, there's animals there, and there's people. And that's the purpose, is to live amongst people. Does that sound similar to anything in the Bible so far?
Garden of Eden?
Okay, well, yeah, that's the second. That's the next, right in the next chapter. But is there any kind of image outside of these first two chapters that sound like that so far?
In Revelation,
What happens in Revelation?
the new heaven and the new earth,
Okay.
like a whole new creation.
Yeah. Notice, I want you to think about that for a second, because that is fascinating when you begin to think about it like this. Notice when we get into chapter 2 now, chapter 2 is like a even smaller view of what's happening between what happened on that sixth day, by the way. He's now zooming in and he's talking about how this took place in this day, what takes place here. A couple things you need to know. At that time, the Lord made the earth and the heavens. There was no shrub of the field that had yet grown in the land. This, by the way, is something, is kind of a clue to what's coming. This is something that comes after the fall, that you're going to have to work through all these shrubs and things like that. They're not in the land right now. There's none of that stuff that's making it difficult for food and sources like that. And no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord had not made it rain on the land. There was no man to work the ground. That's another highlight of that too. Now the mist would come up from the earth and the water and all the ground. The Lord formed man out of the dust of the ground, and he breathed breath of life into his nostrils. He became a living being. And he planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he placed the man that he had formed. The Lord caused to grow out of the ground every tree pleasing in appearance, good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, as well as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now that's important too, because you bring up a great point about the trees that we begin to see in Revelation, right? What is John doing? John's drawing on this chapter. Notice what he says in Revelation 22. He showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God out of the Lamb down to the middle of the city's main street. The tree of life was on each side of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit in every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nation. So we do see that John seems to be building off of something here. A little bit more, though. Let's go a little more. He plants that garden, and Lord caused to grow out of the ground every tree pleasing in appearance, good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, as well as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, this is interesting, too, because now look at the rivers. Let's find out. I've always wanted to know where the garden was. And if, like I'm saying, chapter 1 is about, here's the land, which would mean the land of Israel, is what's in view. Is chapter 1 is all about creating Israel. Where is this garden located, which is in Israel? That's something else that's interesting to think about. The river went out from Eden to water the garden, and there it was divided and became the source of 4 rivers. So these 4 rivers are kind of ones that if we can kind of know where they are, we will kind of figure out where the location of this garden is. The first is the Pishon, which flows from the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold from that land is pure bdellium, and onyx are also there. Now, we don't really know where that is. Some of these are ancient rivers that, some of them could have gotten changed, the names. Some of them, just over time, gone. The name of the second river is the Gihon, which flows through the entire land of Cush. Where is Cush? Anybody know what the biblical location of the land of Cush is? Cush. No, the next rivers are, right? Cush is Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia. That's the southern parts. Those are the more African parts of Egypt. There's a large river that runs through that land. It's called the Nile. And that's interesting. We would kind of assume that as we're talking about the major river that flows through that land is the Nile River, and now it's called Cush. It's called from the Gihon. So we kind of assume that we're talking about maybe the same river here. Then we get to the name of the third river is the Tigris, which runs east of Assyria, and the fourth river of the river Euphrates. And so it's interesting, if you were to look at the map, let's see if I can throw up a map for us to just see. Can I do this? I think so. If you're listening, this is irrelevant for you, but that's okay. These people on the microphone, not you people. This is important. Let's show you the picture. Come on. Where did it go? That's not what I wanted. Okay. I don't know why my thing didn't show up. Let's see. There it is. Okay. Check this out. Here's this map this is Iraq today. And I want you to notice these rivers here. Okay. This is why typically people think of, that the Garden of Eden was in is in Iraq, because you have these two rivers that flow here, right here, which is typically, it's called the Fertile Crescent. Let's see if I can show you a different image. Anyways, what we're seeing is we've got these rivers that are here. They flow like this. And you've also got this one here, this one in Cush. And so I think we're not talking about just these two, because there's 4 rivers listed. I think what we're talking about is right here. Once again, it's just highlighting that the location of this garden is not here between those two. It's somewhere with those 4, and I think those locations are telling us exactly where it is. I think we're dealing with Israel once again. A couple other things I think we need to look at. Lord took the man, placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it. Interesting with these words, by the way. If you look at the word, the work, right? On my text, if you'll see right here, it is the word it's the same word that's there to serve. Also like serving in the temple as worship. And then to watch is the word to keep. It's the same word to obey, like when he says keep the commands. And I think one of the things that we understand is after the fall, man is supposed to till and work the ground. But I think what he's saying here is, I think actually the translation should be that he brought him there to worship and obey. And the Lord commanded the man, you're free to eat from any of the tree of the garden. You must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For the day you eat from it, you'll certainly die. And the Lord said, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper corresponding to him. And the Lord formed out of the ground every wild animal. Now, this is, by the way, he's in the garden at this point. So recognize that he's already created things outside the garden. These are the things that are in the garden that are with him. This is not necessarily how the order took place. This is dealing with zoomed in the garden here. The Lord formed out of the ground every wild animal, every bird of the sky, and brought each to man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to the livestock, to the birds of the sky, and every wild animal. But for the man, no helper was found corresponding to him. The Lord caused a deep sleep to come over the man, and he slept. And God took one of his ribs and closed the flesh at that place. The Lord made the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman and brought her to the man. And the man said, at last, this one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, for she was taken from man. And this is why man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh. Man and his wife both were naked and felt no shame. So he has created a garden that he was going to place these two individuals in, and he was going to live amongst them. Because here's some interesting details that you find out in chapter 3. After they have sinned, notice what verse 8 says. The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. Do you understand that the relationship that Adam and Eve had in the garden was one where they knew what it sounded like when God was walking by? Who, by the way, is walking in the garden? That's one of those questions I always love to ask, is because God has no form, but yet we also know that there's an individual who is God, who is in the text, who is seen and has a form. I think it's clear to see that this is Jesus who has been walking and hanging out, but they know the sound, right? That's why when he says, I heard you in the garden, I was afraid and I was naked, so I hid. Like he knows what it was. And so here's what I'm trying to get at, is I think what's happening in the first 2 chapters, before we get into some even more details, which is fascinating, is that what God has decided to do is out of the entire planet was a wasteland at this point. It's uninhabitable. Nothing's happening on this water world. He begins to create a spot on the earth that he is going to create man, and he's going to live amongst him. And he wants a relationship with these people, and he wants them to enjoy him, and he wants them to worship and to obey, and he wants them to experience him, and he wants to live amongst them. And they have the most perfect conditions, and that is gone by chapter 3. And really the rest of the story is, right, of how do we get back to something like that? And we find the culmination of all of that in the book of Revelation, where now, over time, the church and God's saints are so innumerable that you don't have just a plot of land. You have this massive city where he now lives amongst all of his people, right? That you begin to see that here it says, the throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will worship him, and they'll see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more, and the people will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, because the Lord will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. Like, these are things that I think what we're seeing is bookends, by the way. Is not only is these first 2 chapters an introduction to the first 5 books, but I think it's the introduction to the entire canon, and Revelation is the perfect conclusion to that we have similar images both starting and ending the book. One is these 2 that he starts with, and the other is his people that he ends with. So that's a fascinating little thing that I think is really cool to look at. We got a few more minutes. Here's what I'd love to show and throw out at you a little bit more, is I think that there are even more parallels that when we really dig into what's happening in the garden, that we're dealing with something that is very special that the rest of the Old Testament looks back to, right? That Adam has this peculiar access to God. They know that God sounds like. They know who he is. They see him. And once sin happens in the life of Adam and Eve, they're kicked out of the garden. Here's a couple things that I think are kind of interesting to look at in chapter 3. Not only do you have the curses that are given for what's happened, but then you get to things like this. Look at verse 22. The Lord God said, since the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, he must not reach out and take from the tree of life, eat and live forever. I think that's part of that too, is that they weren't meant to be necessarily... Their longevity, their life was completely sustained by the Lord and his giving them access to the tree. They weren't, to begin with, immortal ever. As long as they had access and God granted them, they were allowed to live. But notice what happens. So the Lord sent him away from the garden to work the ground from which he was taken. And this is what's very interesting. He drove the man out and stationed the cherubim and the flaming whirling sword east of the Garden of Eden to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, here's what I think is fascinating when you begin to really look at the parallels and the imagery here. This is going to be, I'm just going to talk to you now. There's a lot of verses, a lot of little things we could do, but I want to show you some things that are really interesting. When you start to look at the book, the rest of the Old Testament, and you find out what eastward is, when they're cast out east, outside of the garden, eventually the descendants, by the time you get to the Noah story, end up right over here in Babylon. And eastward, right, is always seen as when you're leaving the land and headed eastward, you're headed into captivity. You're headed into judgment, into Babylon. It's the same thing that happens in Israel's story. Israel is in the land, and they enjoy the land until God finally casts them out of them, and they go into captivity eastward. What I'm contending is not only are we hearing the story of what God's intention was, but we see the same story kind of repeats over, that these are stories about what is actually happening to Israel, that they enjoyed the presence of the land, but had to go out in captivity because of the sin that they had in the land. Here's another little thing that I think is fascinating. Let's see if I can get some slides, because I'll make it easier to look at for some of this stuff. Some garden parallels with the tabernacle. That it's interesting when you look at the story of the tabernacle, when you look at the story of the temple, you begin to realize that the construction of the temple, the construction of the tabernacle, is very much reminiscent of the imagery of the garden. What for? because it's showing you that's where God's presence is. That's where it was, and they had it before. And this is the closest you can get in the old covenant to what that old presence was. It's the same thing. Like if you begin to think about the story like this, and I'll get you there. Man is kicked out of the garden, and now we see sin spiraling out of control. And then we pick up with the Noah story and all that happens there, and so life starts over. They go to the Tower of Babel, and man is once again rebellious, and God has to spread them over the earth. And then he starts with Abraham. He picks Abraham out of this, and he begins to work through Abraham to bring blessing to the nation, to bless this man and his family. And so you begin to follow through this of like the blessings of the land to regain that, to regain what was lost by chapter 3, to where really the pinnacle of the Torah is when he brings them to Mount Sinai. And now you have all the descendants of Abraham standing around the mountain, and it says to them, I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. And it's very interesting. If you actually read the exchange in in Exodus 19, it almost seems like at that moment he was giving them the opportunity, like we could do this again, like the Genesis 1 and 2 stuff. But what happens is, it's really awkward. You read about it right in 19, and then you read about it in 20 after the 10 Commandments, is they no longer trust God, and they don't fear, and they say, we don't want that. Why don't you have somebody else go between us? You speak for God before us, but we don't want to go up and talk to God. It's fascinating. And so then he gives them the 10 Commandments, and then right after that, you begin to get the golden calf. And then you now see that instead of being, as God had promised them, a nation of priests where they would represent God and have that relationship, they now become this nation with priests. And now they have this tabernacle. But all the imagery of the tabernacle is there to show that it's meant to kind of reminisce about what was in the garden, what was there and what they had lost. A couple things that I think is interesting, like if you look at some of these parallels for that. So notice that in the garden, when he casts them out, he stations 2 cherubim there to guard it, right? And if you actually look on the veil and how what would block access to the Ark of the Covenant is what? On the veil. It's 2 cherubim that have been pushed into the veil, that that design is to mark what? That something that is behind that, and it's actually to the east of it as well, that you head west into the tabernacle, right? You're seeing that in that tabernacle, you've got the cherubim guarding access to the Lord, and the same way that behind that is what they had before, but nobody gets that anymore. It's not until later on that tabernacle is torn, that the veil is torn. It's interesting, you see the menorah, even the way that the light fixture is done. And if you begin to look, especially if you look at the way that's built, it's got these buds on the end of it, flowery buds that to be carrying all the light in it. And it's peculiar that you have this thing that looks like a tree that is in the tabernacle that's bringing light in there. What's up with the tree imagery? Right? When you look at some of the precious metals, those precious metals that are put in there are some of the same ones that are talked about in the tabernacle that are talked about in the garden area. When you begin to look into some of the stuff in how the temple was built, there's all this focus on plant imagery and all that, and I think all of that is designed to say this is the tabernacle, this is the garden, this is where God reigns and lives amongst his people, but nobody else is able to go in anymore. It's lost at this point. We deal with a tabernacle and a tent and a temple. That's as good as it's going to be. It's never going to be like that until the change comes. And I think what we do see is when we read the first 5 books is we see paradise starts, we lose it, and God begins to work with this sinful people to create a place where he will live amongst his people and reign and rule through them. And yet we still close with the fact that there's something wrong with those people. When you read the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the way that it closes, it's not a good one saying, if you just keep this up and you keep doing what you're going to do, it's all going to be good. We end by saying like, no, these people are never going to enjoy the land truly because God's going to have to kick them out again. And so you see these parallels begin to spin as you begin to read more of the book. You see a lot more parallels of being in the land, enjoying the land in the presence of God, and then being kicked out, because of the sin that's there. All right, so I want to stop. There's tons of stuff I told you. Like I could skip around forever on this, but I want to take, if you have questions for just a few minutes on what we're trying to get at on this. I will say this. If this is the case, if the story of 1 and 2 is all about the promised land, then it still doesn't do what? It still doesn't help you answer the question of, well, what is it? Is it billions of years or is it thousands of years? That's not a question that's answered necessarily by the text. It doesn't tell us, it's not meaning to tell us that. It's meaning to tell us that he created this spot in which he was going to live amongst his people. Now, there is a case that could be made. I just told you I was going to open up for questions, and I start talking again. I'm sorry. I will stop in just a sec. There is a case made, like the gap theorists make, that there could be, if this is an action, verse 1 is an action, God creates the universe, now he begins to focus on just this promised land, the land where nothing, and I'll say this, as it's happening in the promised land, I think it's happening over the whole entire globe, that the focus is the promised land, but there's no humans, there's no animals, there's nothing that lives on this planet at all. The planet is a water waste right now. But as he's doing it here, I think that's what's in focus. We all start in the promised land, but as he's shifting waters and as he's shifting all that's all happening around the planet as well. But humanity is something special. These animals, these creatures are something special and new that he's added. That being said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. From verse 1 to verse 2, the truth is, I think you could make a point to say God created the entire universe, and then when he starts to create the promised land, could have been, I think if you want to throw billions of years in there, okay. Truth be told, I think from the time he created the universe to where he wanted to start, could have been a millisecond. We just don't answer that. The question's not answered there. And so one thing I want us to think about, though, is we don't need to force and shove that into this text. Because I think when you read the text for what it says, you're actually reading it as part of the larger story, right? That the whole story is about this people that have been kicked out and they're sinful, and God wants to work with them, and he wants to give them a place to be with them and to live amongst them in the land one day. And it started like that, and we're trying to get there at the end of the book. That's what the story is about. It's about God living amongst the people who are sinful and still trying to redeem them through it all, right? It's not meant to jam all these years in necessarily, but you still have to mentally and apologetically try to figure out what you're at. I just don't know if I can give you that answer. I think if we're going to focus on something, my preference would be that we build an interpretation of the text that says, how does the text interact with the rest of the text of the Bible? Not how does it interact with the text of science today or history today? Because what we think is established now 100 years may be completely different. And I'd hate to reevaluate my interpretation after every single scientific finding. And so if I'm going to put my eggs in some sort of basket, I'm going to put it in, how does this relate to the rest of the world of the text? Not necessarily that. But look, I still have to have some sort of a conversation with people about the years. And so I have to pick that. I don't know the answer, though, right? That's not my field. But I think there's good places to begin to read that literature about what we think about that. But I do think that the point of this text is thematic in that it's pointing to God's presence with his people. And not necessarily, let me tell you how it all came about in all these years and all this time and all of that. It's there, but it doesn't tell us specifically. All right, any questions or thoughts on this stuff before we are done tonight?
I have a question.
Yeah.